My name is Richard August, and I'll be your host for this edition of State of the State. Our guests are Megan Reilly and Jim McGwin, both residents of North Kingstown. Today we hear many candidates for elective office and public officials talk about transparency and accountability. Well, what we seem to get is opaqueness and obfuscation. Two controversies in North Kingstown illustrate this dichotomy. First is an attempt by the school committee to investigate the existence of racism in North Kingstown schools, and second, in what has become known as the Aaron Thomas affair. Why don't we begin by having each of you tell our audience about yourself. Mrs. Reilly?
My name is Megan Reilly, and I, along with my husband, live in North Kingstown with our 4 children, ages 4 through 13, and they all attend North Kingstown schools, 3 different schools at the time. And I am also a former Spanish teacher, but I now stay at home with my children.
Bueno. Mr. McGwin?
Hi, Jim McGwin, lifelong Rhode Island resident. I had my daughter grow up through the North Kingston school system. I've got about 40 years of international business experience. But
well, both of you are active in the, let's call it the political scene or the governmental scene in North Kingstown, correct?
Yes.
I've spoken many times at public comment.
First-term school committee member Jennifer Lima, who proclaims that she is the mother of biracial children and led a memorial tribute to George Floyd, was instrumental in the creation of a diversity, equity, and inclusion subcommittee to investigate whether the North Kingstown schools are racially or gender phobic, racially sensitive. Now, the committee set out to investigate this, and the school committee allocated money to actually conduct this survey. There was a public meeting at which bids were from several firms responding to the request were to be opened. Now, Mrs. Reilly, please correct or expand on what I said. You attended this public bid opening, correct?
Yes, I was the only resident there, and the bids, there were only 2 proposals, and both of them were read to me by Mary King and Denise Mansieri, who's our assistant superintendent. And that was about, I just heard some very brief information on the proposals.
So did they actually select a firm to do this work?
No, this was just the opening. So what has to happen, the proposals went to the DEI subcommittee for review and recommendation, and that will then be sent on to the school committee fairly soon, in the next couple weeks, for the full school committee to vote on the recommendations of the subcommittee.
Did the bids have a price for the work included?
Yes, one of the bids was $53,000 and another bid was $73,000. And the recommended company is the one that's going to cost $73,000.
Do you remember the name of that firm? Was it Equity?
The Equity Institute?
Yeah.
No, it was Public Consulting Group out of Boston, Massachusetts.
Okay. So when you asked to see a copy of, this is a public bid opening, you asked to see the bids, and what did they tell you?
Yes, so at the time they said there's too much information, the bids were about this thick each, and it was my first time going to one of these openings, so I didn't think to ask questions. I did take some notes on basics, how much it was going to cost, what the names of the companies were, and some other information. But I was told that all of the information, all of the proposals, would be put up on the school website shortly. That was in November, and as of January, they had not been posted. So in fact, someone from the town, in order to see the proposals, was told he needed to file an APRA to see the proposals, and in fact he had to. And then shortly thereafter, once the bids went public, once this gentleman sent around the proposals and some people started putting it online, all of a sudden the school department magically had the proposals appear on their website.
Interesting coincidence. So the APRA is the Access to Public Records Act, which is Rhode Island's version of the Freedom of Information Act.
Yes.
Okay. They didn't say well, I don't know. There was another person that did that, so you don't know whether they charged him for sometimes they'll say we're going to charge you for copies. of it.
Right. Do you know whether or not he was charged? I don't know.
Probably
that he was.
not.
Okay.
I think they give an hour, and then they start charging, but I'm not sure. If you do it electronically, they won't.
Okay.
I would like to add that at the proposal, at the bid opening, I did ask a couple of questions that I thought were very basic questions that they should be able to answer, especially because Dr. Mansieri is in charge of our curriculum. One of the questions was, we just had a curriculum overhaul in the fall where that had nothing to do with the equity audit or these proposals, and it was to the tune of millions of dollars. So when this equity audit comes forward with recommendations, are they going to now ask us to change our curriculum again? And all the costs that come along with the proposal recommendations or the equity audit recommendations. And I was told that I should APRA that question.
Well, let's move on to another topic that has received a lot of press, both locally and, in fact, I believe internationally. Mr. McGwin, would you summarize for us the situation involving former North Kingstown teacher and high school basketball coach Aaron Thomas?
Very simply, since apparently 1994, a teacher was doing naked fat testing in the schools. This was identified apparently in 2016, 2017, 2018. There's several students, former students, who have come forward and said they specifically told the superintendent that there was naked fat testing going on. Nothing was done about it until last February, when former students came forward again, and the school department put Mr. Thomas on leave, and they hired an outside lawyer to do an investigation, Mr. Oliverio. He gave his report on June 18th. The school committee met on June 22nd, and on June 24th, Mr. Thomas was allowed to leave. Apparently, it was just identified with a filing in court that Mr. Thomas had taken school student documents with him, and there's a hard drive missing. So there's an investigation with Mr. Oliverio. The town has hired a former Judge McGurl to oversee it. There's an investigation with the state attorney general, and the U.S. Department of Justice has a civil rights investigation.
And potentially RIDE now.
And it also RIDE. And one of the things that is most concerning is, under Rhode Island law, anyone who believes that a child has been abused has the obligation to contact DCYF. That was not done in 2016, 2017, 2018, and the law was 2016, I believe. And a specific document was put together by the former head of RIDE, Rhode Island Department of Ed, stipulating what had to happen if there was child abuse. I think it's a 20-page document. None of those regulations were followed in 2017 or 18, and DCYF was only notified in February of last year, and Rhode Island Department of Ed was not notified until August of last year. And in the meantime, there is concern that in June, there was some kind of deal made that Mr. Thomas could leave the state, and nothing would happen. And he eventually ended up at Monsignor Clark, at a school that's elementary and middle school. And apparently when I think either one of the former students had found out, tipped off Channel 12. Channel 12 broke the story. And what's concerning is that Mr. Oliverio gave his report before Mr. Thomas left. And he had recommendations in that about what to do to protect kids. None of those recommendations were ever acted on. And we've asked several times. It was only until January that they even mentioned them. But
January of
This year.
2022. And, the fact that the report was received as, you were just talking about access to public records requests, by Channel 12, under an access to public records request. If it was a public record, why wasn't it released in June to help protect children? And that's really our concern, is that not only the students who allegedly were abused, but potentially other students, children that could be abused when he was let go, and no one knew.
So these complaints go back to 2016. Were they made by students or parents? Who was doing the complaining? Do you have any idea?
I believe it was, and Mrs. Reilly has direct contact with some of the whistleblowers, so she knows.
Were they students or teachers or who?
So the 2016 one is not yet clear to me exactly. In 2017, in the 87-page report Mr. Oliverio gave, they actually talked about a few teachers who witnessed an incident that they thought was inappropriate and told the principal at the time, which was Dr. Mansieri, about it. And she didn't write it down, so her memory is vague, which is actually in the report. And then in 2018, the first whistleblower went to the North Kingstown Police Department and sat with them and talked to them and was told that an investigation team would be put together, a task force would be put together. 2 months later, independent of the first whistleblower, a second whistleblower came forward and talked to Dr. Auger and told him, and this is actually documented, that he was in fact, Mr. Thomas had been conducting these naked fat tests. And Dr. Auger has come forward many times and said he was never told that fat tests were being done naked, with students being naked. And then in 2021, a third whistleblower came forward in February of 2021, corroborating these stories. And now we're up to 5 victims, whistleblowers, who have come forward. The last 2, or at least the last one of the last 2, the incidents occurred after 2018, so 2019, 2020. And they got more physical in nature and more aggressive in nature because Mr. Thomas felt emboldened at that point because nothing was being done.
When you refer to Dr. Auger, you're referring to the superintendent of schools in North Kingstown.
Yes.
Yes.
So the whistleblower, the complainant, told him directly in your...
Yes, he was an alumni, so he had met with Dr. Auger outside of school grounds. He just happened to run into him in town, and he just struck up a conversation where he mentioned, oh, is this still occurring? And Dr. Auger then decided to take matters into his own hands and pulled, this is all in the report, pulled some of the people involved, Mr. Thomas, the athletic director at the time, Dr. Mansieri aside, and had a meeting saying basically knock it off, and we're gonna buy a $5,000 machine so that you don't have to physically touch the students anymore. You can just use this caliper machine. A major problem, talk about no transparency, was there's actually a school policy that says Dr. Auger, as superintendent, is allowed to make these decisions, but once he makes these decisions, he then immediately, at the next school committee meeting, needs to bring this to the school committee members. And that would have been a nice, stopgap. That would have been a nice protection put in place had he told 5 school committee members that this allegation was brought to his attention, and he never did that. So, because they would have then been obligated to report that to DCYF, and Dr. Auger did not report it to DCYF in 2018, and he still to this day denies that the student told him that the students were being tested naked.
What happened to the report? You said the North Kingstown Police Department formed a task force to investigate. What happened? Did they do anything? Did they find anything?
No.
Initially, the Attorney General dropped it.
They
Attorney
dropped
General Norona or
Norona
They dropped it in July and
of 21
of this past year. Yes, a few months ago, and quite frankly, it looks like the only reason everybody got involved in all of these investigations, once again, was because the story broke, only because the whistleblowers went to the media and finally just said, enough is enough. Nobody's listening to us. Nobody's doing anything. Nobody's acting upon this. And now Mr. Thomas is teaching at another school, area school, and could potentially do this to other students. And they just wanted to make sure that other students were safe from his actions. And so they had to go to the media. They had no other choice.
You said that Mr. Thomas, after leaving North Kingstown, he secured a position with a parochial school. Didn't they check on his background at the parochial school?
They actually did, and the person responsible for doing it at the diocese is a former state trooper. But because it wasn't reported to RIDE
Or DCYF.
or DCYF, there was nothing for him to
No
see.
background.
Nothing.
Had it been reported, yeah.
In fact, I've heard, I can't confirm this, but I think I even saw the screenshot that Mr. Thomas's license, educator license, is still active on the RIDE website. So I have to go back and confirm that. But
Yeah, it was just last week that the attorney for the former students actually wrote a letter to Rhode Island Department of Ed and said they need to start taking action.
Yeah, see, because one or more of those students is represented by this attorney. They have actually filed civil suit against Mr. Thomas, correct?
Yes.
So
Yes.
Mr. Thomas obviously has retained legal counsel as well.
Yes.
And have they had a hearing? Is that where this came out, that he was writing, the lawyer for the complaints was writing a letter to RIDE?
It's actually in the news. It's actually, again, one of the things about this story is it's been picked up all over the world. It's been in the Daily Mail in England. It's been in Ireland, Australia. It's newsworthy because of, children being abused. And one of the things that's come out of this, quite sadly, is Rhode Island's age of consent. Rhode Island's age of consent is 14 for touching, and it's 16 for
More intimate
Yes.
contact?
more intimate
yes.
contact. And it's, and the thing is that every time it comes up before the state legislature, the teachers union are the ones that push back on it. And I'm working with Senator Dela Cruz. There's a bill, Senate Bill 2219, I believe is the number, this year, very simply to say that anyone who's in direct control, has custody of a child, cannot abuse them. And I think we need to do that. So this is an important issue.
Rhode Island and Massachusetts have the lowest consent age in the whole entire country. We're the only two states where at 14 years old, a student can technically, or a minor can technically consent to, again, anything but more serious, intimate.
They can consent to touching by an adult or another student? Or another
Adult.
An adult, okay. So we have investigations into these allegations by the Attorney General, the U.S. Attorney, North Kingstown Police Department, and attorneys have been retained, actually a judge has been retained, former judge, by the school committee.
By the town council.
And the town council, school committee has an attorney. Everybody's looking into this thing, and it seems to me that some of them are a little late to the party, aren't they?
They're very late to the party. And the thing that, Dick, as you know, I've been involved in looking at school issues for a number of years, going back almost 20 years. And in 2006, the Auditor General came to North Kingston and cautioned of the current and future risk of fraud in the school department. He couldn't find anything himself, but he had concerns. And since then, we have had to terminate a superintendent because of misuse of special ed funds, and a athletic director, which was involved with Mr. Thomas for vending money and some other issues. I think that the lack of transparency, the culture in the school department is a major problem. And you know, even on the financial, mostly I've been involved in financial issues. North Kingston School Department will not let the town finance director look at their general ledger and their accounts. But he's responsible under Rhode Island law to sign off on them. So I've asked the Auditor General to come back and identify, you know, in the RIDE regulations for what they call housing aid, when you spend money on a bond, the state will refund you a certain amount. It requires the superintendent and the town finance director, and it's done for clarity and transparency between the school and the town. North Kingston is probably one of the most secretive school departments, organizations I've ever encountered. And I've done international business and done due diligence around the world. I've never seen an organization so secretive and less transparent. And I believe that's the petri dish that this kind of abuse went on for 24 years. School committee members did not know about this. We've got a town council member. She was on for, I believe, 8 years, and she was head of the policy committee. She was chairman of the school committee. She didn't know anything about it. And one of the things I've asked that Judge McGwin look at is, how could this have been going on for so long? And the superintendent works for the school committee. How could it happen that the school committee did not know? And I think one of the things we have to do is we have to look at the culture of lack of transparency. Yeah.
And if I could just jump in and add on to that, that is now why the 5 whistleblowers brought that complaint via their attorney, Mr. Conlon, to the U.S. Attorney and the Department of Justice, because they are asking that the whole school department be investigated. And I believe that includes the school committee members, the current school committee members, or really anyone who was involved. But they feel that their civil rights were violated because of lack of transparency, secrecy, hiding things. I mean, it took 6 months for the Oliverio Phase 1 report to come out that was being paid for by taxpayer money. It was a public record, and it was only because it was forced out of them that they really agreed to release it. And now Mr. Conlon's letter as of Friday to RIDE is also asking, in fact demanding, that RIDE take action against the people involved. And he names specific individuals, our superintendent, our assistant superintendent, and he says that, you know, again, on behalf of my clients, they were involved and they need to be held accountable because there's just been too much secrecy. And even now, you email the school committee members about this, or just basic questions. When is this second Oliverio report coming out? He's on phase 2 of the report, and it was supposed to come out at the end of January. And now it's the beginning of March. They said it'll come out the beginning of March. I mean, when you hire someone to do a job, don't you tell them when the project is due? And don't you as the employer tell them, this is our budget, and this is the due date. We're asking for this report to come out. And it's the complete opposite.
There's so many laws, regulations, Rhode Island regulations, and school committee policies that were not adhered to.
Violated.
That were not. I mean, it's not for a lack of rules and regulations. It's a lack of reporting. Through this whole thing, Rhode Island law requires health and wellness meetings. They haven't had them. And when I asked for the minutes, which is supposed to be available, they didn't even have the minutes of prior meetings. All through COVID, they didn't discuss it. So, you know, the thing is, you would think that after Mr. Oliverio's first report, they would have started looking at his recommendations of how to protect children. They didn't. And
one of his recommendations was to conduct an audit to look into the anti-discrimination policies and procedures of the district. And ironically, that didn't happen. And so what happens? the 5 victims say, we're going to take matters into our own hands. We're going to then file a complaint that you are violating our civil rights and the civil rights of the students who are there. But had they just taken into account the recommendation that their lawyer gave to them in June, perhaps that would have been avoided.
I have a really basic question that just occurred to me. Why was Coach Aaron Thomas conducting these tests on students? I mean, that's not something a basketball coach normally does. What was the reason for this?
Well, there's different scenarios of how we get started, but one of them is with the former athletic director, and one of the things the former student's attorney is looking at is the fact that they were doing some of this fat testing and other testing of biometrics back in 2005, 2006 to build a database for commercial purposes to sell to other schools. There was no authorization by parents or students to do that. And so there were a lot of things. That's my point.
So they're testing students to build a database to make it commercially available to
Other schools for recruiting purposes.
And so, were any of the students advised that this was
that it was no,
was a parental consent form signed for any of these?
not for that, and that is there's federal regulations about doing that, FERPA records and whatnot. That was a problem. I thought I uncovered that, and when I reported it back in 2009, and the athletic director left, I thought that was the end of it, quite frankly. But apparently, Mr. Thomas continued to do it.
So this goes back to actually before Aaron Thomas became involved in the program, or was he involved with it?
He was involved in the
whole
program
thing from the beginning?
yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
It goes back to the 90s.
Okay. This school committee member, one of them, Jennifer Lima, who we referred to earlier, I understand has recused herself from discussions involving Mr. Thomas. Is that true, and why?
That is true, because she said that, and this was in a Boston Globe article, that it came out that she talked to her adult son, who said that he was one of Mr. Thomas's victims. But what the follow-up to all of that is that she recused herself officially and publicly on December 2nd. By that point, the allegations from the third whistleblower had been brought to the attention, and therefore all the allegations up until that point. In February of 2021, that she was part of the committee that voted to terminate Mr. Thomas based on these allegations in February. Then she also voted to start an investigation, to have Mr. Oliveria start his investigation. The investigation lasted 4 months. She was part of everything up until December. She knew that he was resigning, or she found out that he resigned. She was part of all the executive sessions where I assume that his case was being discussed. She was privy to all of this information. She was shown the Oliveria report in June. And then in October, a letter at the very last school committee meeting, right before this story broke publicly.
We're out of time, just about.
Oh, okay.
So, it's
So
okay.
she was involved. She knew all of this stuff.
Okay.
She knew the story was going to break, and she stayed involved clear up until December 2nd.
We want to thank you, audience, for watching this edition of State of the State. We'll see how this story will continue to unfold. Thank you for watching State of the State.